On the frozen morning of December 17, 1944, SS Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper stood in the cupola of his command half-track, watching the fog lift from the Lienne River valley near the village of Chevron. Behind him stretched a column of steel and fuel fumes that disappeared into the Ardennes mist, nearly 16 miles of Germany's last armored gamble. At the spearhead, the King Tiger, a 72-ton cathedral of German engineering whose 88mm gun could punch through any Allied tank at 2 kilometers. Its Zimmerit-coated armor, thick as a man's forearm, glistened with morning frost and road mud. Peiper's orders were simple, brutal, and desperate. Reach the Meuse River bridges before the Allies could reinforce. Speed was everything. And the Führer had promised a repeat of 1940's lightning thrust through these same forests, the blow that would split the Allied armies and buy Germany time to negotiate peace. But as Peiper's lead tank commander, Oberscharführer Franz Prahm, guided his King Tiger toward the stone bridge at Chevron, he saw what the maps hadn't told them. The bridge was narrow, medieval, built for farm carts, not for machines that weighed more than 10 elephants. Prahm radioed back, his voice crackling through static. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, the bridge. It won't hold." Peiper felt the cold certainty settle in his gut. He'd known these tanks were monsters. He'd privately called them furniture vans for their bulk and sluggishness. But orders were orders. "Send the half-tracks across first. Secure the far side. Then we'll find another route." The lighter vehicles rolled forward, their tracks clattering on cobblestones. Then came the crack of American rifles from the tree line. Paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne dug in and waiting. The lead half-track exploded in a fountain of orange flame. Another veered sideways, its crew spilling out only to be cut down in the snow. Within minutes, the crossing attempt had become a killing zone. Behind Peiper, the column ground to a halt. 72 tons of invincible armor, and they couldn't cross a village bridge. The battalion turned around, a maneuver that took hours on the single-lane forest road, burning precious fuel with every meter. They would try again tomorrow at another crossing, but Kampfgruppe Peiper would never get closer to their objective than this moment. And the disaster at Chevron was more than a tactical setback. It was a snapshot of Germany's fatal miscalculation. The Ardennes offensive would ultimately fail not because of enemy firepower, but because the German Panzer Corps had become a victim of its own philosophy. Superior engineering had produced tanks too heavy for the roads, too complex to repair, and too thirsty to fuel. The King Tigers that Hitler believed would win the war would instead become stranded monuments to the iron law of modern warfare. Logistics defeats legend. The stone bridge at Chevron had stood for 3 centuries, built when the heaviest thing crossing it was a merchant's wagon loaded with wool. Now it faced a King Tiger, a machine that represented the absolute apex of German tank design and the absolute nadir of German strategic thinking. Peiper watched through his binoculars as Prahm's crew approached the span, the tank's treads crushing the frost-hardened ground into black powder. The bridge didn't collapse dramatically. It simply settled, groaning, its ancient mortar cracking with sounds like rifle shots. Prahm backed off immediately, but the damage was visible even from 100 meters away. The center stones had shifted, creating a buckle that would collapse under any significant weight. "What now?" Prahm's voice came through the radio, and tinged with the flat resignation of a man who'd fought in Russia and knew when physics had won. Peiper didn't answer immediately. Behind him, the column waited. Panthers, Tiger is, more King Tigers, half-tracks carrying the SS Panzer Grenadiers who were supposed to exploit the breakthrough once the armor reached the Meuse. 16 miles of vehicles, all burning fuel, all waiting for him to solve a problem that had no solution. The map showed 3 other bridges within 5 kilometers. But if this one couldn't hold, why would the others? These weren't the reinforced crossings of the French highways. These were farm bridges in the backwater Ardennes, a region chosen for the offensive precisely because it was considered impassable for armor, which meant the infrastructure was built for anything except armor. The turnaround took 4 hours. On the narrow forest road, each tank had to reverse, turn, advance, reverse again, the drivers sweating in their compartments despite the December cold. They burned fuel that couldn't be replaced. They blocked the supply trucks that were supposed to be bringing forward ammunition and rations. And all the while, American artillery observers were calling in coordinates, bracketing the stationary column with 105mm howitzer fire that sent tree bursts raining shrapnel down on the exposed crews. By nightfall, they'd lost 3 vehicles, not to enemy action, but to mechanical breakdown. A Panther threw a track. A King Tiger's transmission, already weakened by the constant reversing, simply gave up, its gears grinding into expensive scrap metal. The crews set demolition charges and moved on, leaving behind machines that had cost more than a small town's annual budget. What Piper didn't know, what he couldn't know, sitting in his half-track with maps that were already obsolete, was that this scene was playing out across the entire German offensive front. The Ardennes operation wasn't failing, it had already failed, betrayed by a fundamental misunderstanding of what modern armored warfare required. The misunderstanding began in the Führer bunker in Berlin, where Adolf Hitler had spread maps across his table and seen 1940 instead of 1944. He remembered the intoxicating rush of that May when German panzers had sliced through these same Ardennes forests like a spear through fabric, reaching the Channel coast in days and trapping the entire British expeditionary force. The planning had been audacious, the execution brilliant, the victory complete. Why couldn't it happen again? But the Panzers of 1940 had been Panzer IIs and IIIs, machines weighing 15 to 20 tons, nimble enough to navigate dirt roads, light enough to cross farm bridges, simple enough that field mechanics could repair them with basic tools and scavenged parts. They'd been built for mobility, not for slugging matches with Soviet-heavy tanks on the Eastern Front. Hitler's 1944 offensive used the lessons learned from 4 years of brutal combat against T-34s and Shermans. Build bigger guns, thicker armor, more powerful engines. The result was the King Tiger, a tank so heavy it couldn't cross most bridges, so complex that replacing its transmission required specialized equipment and a full week of work, so fuel-hungry that it could barely travel 50 kilometers on a full tank. The Führer had ordered a blitzkrieg. He'd provided tanks built for siege warfare. The orders came down through Wehrmacht channels with the usual Baroque German military precision. Kampfgruppe Piper was to advance along Route D, seize the fuel depot at Büllingen, continue northwest to the Meuse River crossings, then wheel north toward Antwerp. Speed was critical. Surprise was critical. The entire operation depended on reaching the Meuse before Allied reinforcements could arrive. 72 hours, maybe 96 at the outside. Piper had done the math in his head and hadn't liked the answer. But you didn't question the Führer's orders, not if you wanted to keep your command, your rank, or possibly your life. So on the morning of December 16th, the column had rolled out, and within hours, they'd learned what the reconnaissance teams had tried to warn them about. The Ardennes wasn't the tank country of northern France. It was a nightmare of steep hills, narrow valleys, and roads that were barely roads at all. The descent into the forest proper came on the second day. The lead tanks left the paved highway and entered what the maps optimistically called improved trails. Dirt tracks that wound through stands of pine and oak, hemmed in by trees so close that the King Tiger's fenders scraped bark on both sides. Piper, riding in his half-track near the front of the column, watched the forest close in like a vice. The tracks, already churned by the lead vehicles, had turned into rivers of mud mixed with snowmelt. The temperature hovered just above freezing, the worst possible condition, warm enough to turn the ground into soup, cold enough that the men were fighting frostbite. The first King Tiger bogged down 3 kilometers into the forest. Its 72 tons simply exceeded what the saturated soil could support. The tank settled into the mud like a ship sinking, its tracks spinning uselessly, flinging rooster tails of black earth mixed with decomposing leaves. The crew tried rocking it, forward, reverse, forward, but each movement only dug the tank deeper. Within 30 minutes, it was up to its hull in muck, the engine screaming as the driver tried to power through physics. "Recovery vehicle," Piper ordered, but he already knew it was futile. The recovery vehicles were designed to tow 20-ton tanks, not 72-ton behemoths. They'd need 3 vehicles working in concert, and there wasn't room on the trail for that kind of operation. And behind the stuck King Tiger, the entire column had stopped again. Panthers idling, burning fuel, their crews dismounting to smoke and watch the recovery attempt with the studied disinterest of men who'd seen this before. What made it worse was that Piper had seen worse. In Russia, the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, had swallowed entire tank battalions. He'd watched T-34s maneuver around bogged-down Tigers, the Soviet tanks lighter and therefore able to float on ground that trapped the German heavies. He'd learned to hate mud more than he hated enemy fire. Mud didn't care about armor thickness or gun caliber. Mud was patient and absolute. But this wasn't supposed to be Russia. This was Belgium, civilized Western Europe, where roads were supposed to be roads and bridges were supposed to hold tanks. And the intelligence briefings had warned about terrain difficulties, but in the context of overwhelming firepower and surprise, those warnings had seemed manageable. What the briefings hadn't mentioned was that manageable became impossible when every vehicle in your column weighed more than the roads were designed to support. They abandoned the King Tiger after 2 hours, set the charges, destroyed the gun, moved on. Another 300,000 man-hours of precision German engineering left behind as a monument to poor planning. The column ground forward at walking pace, sometimes slower. Piper stood in his half-track's cupola, watching the fuel gauges with growing dread. Each King Tiger carried 860 liters of fuel. Sounds like a lot until you did the math. The Maybach HL 230 engine, pushing 72 tons through mud and up forested hills, it consumed fuel at a rate that would be comical if it weren't catastrophic. Under ideal road conditions, a King Tiger might manage half a mile per gallon. In these conditions, fighting gravity and friction, the number dropped to perhaps a third of that. Piper pulled out his map and calculator, working the numbers that he'd been avoiding since the operation began. The Meuse River was roughly 75 kilometers from their starting point. At current consumption rates, accounting for detours and terrain, his King Tigers would run dry somewhere around the 50-kilometer mark, assuming they could even maintain forward progress, which was looking increasingly unlikely. The fuel plan had been simple, even elegant. Capture American fuel depots intact and use enemy supplies to continue the advance. The Americans had fuel everywhere. Their entire war machine ran on it, abundant and carelessly stored. The first major depot was supposed to be at Billingen, 20 kilometers ahead. Piper checked his watch. They were 12 hours behind schedule and still 15 kilometers from Billingen. Even if the depot was there, even if it was intact, even if they could capture it before the Americans destroyed it, they'd arrive with tanks already running on fumes. "Radio check," he called to his signals officer. "Get me fuel consumption reports from all company commanders." The reports came back within 20 minutes, and they confirmed what he'd calculated. The Panthers were slightly better off. They were lighter, more fuel efficient, but still burning through their reserves at unsustainable rates. The Tiger were in similar condition to the King Tigers. The worst were the captured American trucks they'd pressed into service. Their engines weren't designed for the stop-and-go crawl, and they were sucking down fuel even faster than the tanks. One of his company commanders, a veteran named Diefenthal, added a postscript to his report. "Herr Obersturmbannführer, at current rates, we'll be on foot by tomorrow evening." Piper didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The mission had been designed around the assumption of speed: reach the Muse in 72 hours, achieve operational surprise, exploit the breakthrough. But speed required fuel, and fuel required either starting with enough or capturing more along the way. They'd started with barely enough for the ideal scenario, and they were living through anything but ideal. He thought about the American Sherman crews, probably sitting in their tanks 50 kilometers west, smoking Lucky Strikes and complaining about sea rations. Their Shermans were mechanically simple, parts interchangeable, running on fuel that came in via an unbroken supply line from the Atlantic coast. If a Sherman threw a track, you could fix it in an hour with tools any mechanic understood. If a Sherman ran dry, you radioed for a fuel truck and it arrived. The Americans built war like they built cars, standardized, mass-produced, with the assumption that logistics mattered more than individual superiority. Germany had built war like they built cathedrals. Each tank a masterpiece of engineering, a statement of technical prowess and cultural supremacy. And now those masterpieces were dying in Belgian mud, not from enemy shells, but from the banal mathematics of fuel consumption and weight-bearing capacity. What Piper couldn't see, what none of the German commanders could see from their positions in the field, was the strategic catastrophe that had been building since 1943. The Allied bombing campaign had done more than destroy German cities. It had shredded the industrial base that made quality steel. The Ruhr Valley, Germany's metallurgical heart, had been hit repeatedly, its blast furnaces and rolling mills operating under constant air raid alerts. Production quotas still got met. German industrial capacity was resilient and redundant, but quality control had become a casualty of desperation. The armor plate on Piper's King Tigers looked impressive, 150 millimeters thick on the frontal arc, sloped to increase effective thickness even further. On paper, it could defeat any Allied tank gun except the British 17-pounder. But the steel itself was no longer the high-quality alloy that had made the early Tigers nearly invincible. Lacking molybdenum, tungsten, and other critical hardening elements, German foundries had been forced to improvise, using lower-grade alloys, cutting corners on heat treatment, accepting batches that would have been rejected in 1942. The result was armor that looked thick but behaved unpredictably. Sometimes it held. Sometimes it shattered on impact, the crystalline structure failing catastrophically, sending spalls of razor-sharp metal fragments ricocheting through the crew compartment. Tank crews had started calling it glass armor, a bitter joke that acknowledged the deadly lottery of whether your protection would save you or kill you. Worse, and the same material shortages affected every component. Transmission gears, made from inferior steel, wore out faster and failed more often. Engine blocks, cast from recycled scrap metal, developed stress fractures under the enormous loads of pushing 72 tons. Track links snapped, suspension springs cracked, final drives seized. Each failure was a death sentence in a combat zone where spare parts couldn't reach you and recovery vehicles couldn't tow you. Piper had seen it firsthand the previous month during training exercises. A brand new King Tiger, fresh from the factory, had suffered a catastrophic armor failure during firing tests. The crew had been conducting a routine gunnery exercise when a practice round, a solid shot without explosives, had struck the frontal glacis at an oblique angle. Instead of deflecting or even penetrating cleanly, the impact had caused the plate to crack like glass, a fracture line running from the point of impact to the weld seam. If it had been a live round, if it had been combat, the crew would have been dead. The inspectors had blamed the metallurgy, pointed to the lack of proper alloys, written reports that went up the chain of command and disappeared into bureaucratic void. Nothing changed. Production continued. Tanks rolled off assembly lines with armor that met dimensional specifications but not material standards. Now those tanks were in the Ardennes, and Piper wondered how many of them were running on borrowed time, their armor plates waiting for that one impact that would reveal the brittleness underneath. And the Americans didn't know about the material failures. They still feared the King Tiger's reputation, still reported its armor as nearly impenetrable. But reputation wouldn't stop a 17-pounder round from a Sherman Firefly, and brittle armor wouldn't save his crews when the shooting started in earnest. The column was dying by inches, strangled by its own weight and complexity. And somewhere ahead, American reinforcements were rushing toward the front, their Shermans lighter, their supply lines intact, their tanks built for a war of logistics rather than a war of legend. The breakdown happened on the third day, just as the column approached a village called Stavilo. A King Tiger in the second company simply stopped moving, its engine coughing once before dying with a mechanical wheeze that every tanker recognized. Final drive failure. Not the tank coasted to a halt at the roadside, and the crew commander reported the situation with the weary professionalism of men who'd seen this play out before. Piper sent his chief mechanic, a grizzled Feldwebel named Koch, to assess the damage. Koch returned 2 hours later with the expression of a doctor delivering terminal news. "The final drive is completely seized, Herr Obersturmbannführer. Metal shavings in the oil. The gears have stripped themselves." "Can you repair it?" Koch laughed, a sound without humor. "Repair it? Sir, to access the final drive on a King Tiger, we need to remove the entire turret first. That requires a mobile crane, which we don't have. Then we need to pull the engine and transmission assembly, which weighs over 3 tons and requires specialized lifting equipment, which we also don't have. Then, and assuming we could somehow perform this miracle, we'd need replacement final drive components, which are sitting in a depot somewhere in Germany, if they exist at all." Piper had known the answer before asking, but hearing it laid out in Koch's matter-of-fact tone made it worse somehow. "Time estimate if we had everything? With proper equipment and parts? 4 days minimum. Here on the roadside in combat conditions, with American forces moving to cut us off?" Koch shrugged. "It's not happening, sir." The mathematics of German over-engineering had finally come due. The Tiger tanks, both the original Tiger I and the newer King Tiger, had been designed with one principle in mind: overwhelming superiority in armor and firepower. Every other consideration had been secondary. Ease of maintenance, secondary. Mechanical reliability, secondary. Of field repairability, secondary. The designers at Henschel had built tanks for winning individual battles, not for sustaining campaigns. The result was a maintenance nightmare. To change the transmission on a King Tiger required removing the turret, 42 tons of steel and machinery that had to be lifted by cranes that didn't exist in the field. The engine, mounted in the rear, could only be accessed after removing deck plates that were secured by dozens of bolts, each one prone to seizing in cold weather. The interleaved road wheel system, designed to distribute the tank's weight more evenly, meant that changing an inner wheel required removing up to 8 outer wheels first, a job that took a full day even under ideal conditions. American tankers could swap out a Sherman's engine in a few hours using a portable hoist and basic tools. But German tankers needed a fully equipped maintenance depot and a week of labor to perform the same task on a Tiger. Koch wasn't finished with his report. "Sir, it's not just this one tank. I've been monitoring the maintenance situation across the column. We've got transmission problems developing in at least 4 other King Tigers. The Panthers are showing track wear that's going to result in failures within the next 100 kilometers, and we're completely out of spare parts for anything more complex than track links and road wheels." "What about cannibalization?" Piper asked, already knowing this answer too. "We've been doing that since day one, sir. But every tank we strip for parts is a tank we're losing from the combat strength. And even with cannibalization, we can't manufacture engine components or transmission gears on the roadside. Once those fail, the tank is finished." Piper looked back at the column, seeing it with new clarity. These weren't tanks anymore. They were automotive corpses waiting for the final mechanical failure that would end their usefulness. Some would die from enemy fire, but most would simply break down, victims of their own complexity and the absence of the industrial support system they required to function. "Demolish it," he ordered. "Set charges on the gun and move on." Coke nodded and walked away. Within the hour, a dull crump echoed through the forest as shaped charges destroyed the King Tiger's 88mm gun, rendering the tank useless even if the Americans managed to recover it. The crew distributed themselves among other vehicles, and the column lurched forward again, now one tank weaker. It became a pattern. Every few kilometers, another tank would stop. Transmission failure, engine failure, suspension collapse, fuel pump malfunction. Each time, Coke would perform his assessment, deliver his verdict, and the demolition crews would do their work. The column was leaving a trail of destroyed armor through the Ardennes like a wounded animal leaving blood spoor. By December 20th, 4 days into the offensive, Kampfgruppe Piper had lost more tanks to mechanical failure than to enemy action. The Americans had barely needed to fight them. They just had to wait for German engineering to defeat itself. The roadside graveyard stretched for kilometers. King Tigers sat motionless, their guns destroyed, their hatches open, their crews gone. The Panthers, with thrown tracks tilted at odd angles, looking like wounded prehistoric beasts. The lighter vehicles, half-tracks, trucks, armored cars, formed a supporting cast of mechanical corpses. Some had been destroyed deliberately to prevent capture. Others had simply been abandoned when the fuel ran out, their crews setting off on foot to try to reach German lines before the American counterattack encircled them. Piper cataloged them mentally as the column passed. The King Tiger with the seized turret ring, immobile and blind. The Panther that had thrown a track while attempting to climb a muddy slope, its driver pushing the engine so hard that the transmission had literally caught fire. The Tiger one that had run completely dry of fuel, sitting pristine and operational but useless without the gasoline to move it. The production statistics haunted him. Each King Tiger represented 300,000 man-hours of labor, skilled craftsmen hand-fitting components, welding armor plate, assembling the intricate transmission and suspension systems. Each one cost as much as a small factory. Germany had built perhaps 500 of them total, and Piper was watching them die in Belgian mud, not from enemy superiority, but from the fundamental impossibility of maintaining such complex machines in field conditions. The Americans, meanwhile, had built over 50,000 Shermans. Each one took 48,000 man-hours to produce, a sixth of the time required for a King Tiger. The quality gap was real. A Sherman couldn't match a Tiger in armor or firepower, but quantity had a quality all its own, and especially when your tanks could be repaired in the field and your supply lines could actually deliver spare parts. The final irony was that the King Tigers weren't even being lost to Sherman fire. They were being lost to themselves, to the hubris of designers who'd prioritized technical perfection over practical reliability, to the resource constraints of a collapsing industrial base, to the simple reality that complexity was a vulnerability when you couldn't maintain it. Yet even as the offensive collapsed around him, Piper witnessed a moment that showed what the Tigers could do under the right circumstances. The one scenario where German over-engineering actually delivered on its promise. At the small town of Beth, a single King Tiger from the 506th Heavy Tank Battalion had taken up a defensive position at a crossroads. The crew, commanded by an Oberscharführer named Dollinger, had no fuel to retreat and no recovery vehicle to tow them. So they'd positioned the tank hull down behind a stone wall, using the elevated position to command the main road into town. When British Sherman tanks from the 2nd Armored Division attempted to push through Beth, Dollinger's King Tiger demolished them methodically. The British tankers, accustomed to facing lighter German armor, had advanced with standard tactics: spread out, use superior numbers, flank, and destroy. Against a King Tiger in a prepared position, those tactics were suicide. The first Sherman died at 1,800 meters, Dollinger's gunner putting an 88mm round straight through its frontal armor before the British tank could even acquire a target. The second and third Shermans tried to flank using buildings for cover, but the King Tiger's turret traverse, slow though it was, proved adequate for tracking targets that had to expose themselves to shoot. 2 more kills. The British pulled back, brought up artillery, and pounded the position for an hour. The King Tiger sat immobile, its armor absorbing hits that would have destroyed any other tank. When the barrage lifted and the Shermans tried again, Dollinger was still there, still fighting. Over the course of 6 hours, his single tank destroyed 9 British Shermans and halted an entire armored battalion's advance. It was exactly what the Tiger had been designed to do: dominate a battlefield through superior firepower and protection, make the enemy pay an impossible price for every meter of ground. In that specific moment, in that specific scenario, the King Tiger was worth every man-hour spent building it. But moments later, Dollinger's crew ran out of ammunition. They'd fired every round in the tank, exhausting their combat load without resupply. And they were still surrounded, still immobile, still out of fuel. That night, under cover of darkness, they abandoned the tank and escaped on foot. The British found the King Tiger the next morning, intact but useless, and eventually towed it away as a trophy. The engagement at Beth illustrated both the triumph and tragedy of German tank doctrine. In a static defensive battle, properly positioned, the King Tiger was nearly invincible. But modern warfare wasn't static. It required mobility, sustainability, logistics. A tank that could destroy 9 enemies but then had to be abandoned for lack of fuel and ammunition hadn't won anything. It had merely delayed the inevitable. That inevitable arrived in force on December 23rd, when American reinforcements flooded into the Ardennes in numbers that made German resistance futile. Among those reinforcements was a tank that changed the calculus of the entire battle. The Sherman Firefly, a British modification of the standard American Sherman that replaced the 75mm gun with a 17-pounder anti-tank gun capable of penetrating even a King Tiger's frontal armor. Piper's column encountered their first Firefly near the village of Stoumont. The engagement lasted less than a minute. The Firefly, positioned in ambush, waited until the lead King Tiger was at point-blank range, perhaps 200 meters, before firing. The 17-pounder round, moving at nearly 900 meters per second, struck the King Tiger's frontal glacis just beside the driver's vision port. The armor held for a microsecond, long enough for the crew to register the impact. Then the plate fractured, not penetrated cleanly, but shattered. The brittle steel failing exactly as the metallurgists had warned. Fragments of the armor plate, transformed into shrapnel by the impact energy, tore through the crew compartment at supersonic speed. The ammunition stored in the hull detonated a moment later, blowing the turret 10 meters into the air in a geyser of flame. The second King Tiger tried to return fire, but the Firefly had already reversed into cover, using the superior mobility of the Sherman chassis to reposition before the German gunner could acquire a target. When the Firefly appeared again, it was from a different angle, and another 17-pounder round found another King Tiger, this time penetrating cleanly through the side armor where it was thinnest. The tactical advantage had evaporated. The King Tigers had been designed to outrange and outgun any Allied tank, to destroy enemies before those enemies could get close enough to threaten them. But in the close terrain of the Ardennes, where engagement ranges dropped to a few hundred meters, that advantage disappeared. And the Firefly's gun, firing specialized tungsten-cored ammunition, could defeat the King Tiger's armor at ranges where the King Tiger's armor had been thought impenetrable. Worse, the Sherman Firefly retained all the advantages of the Sherman platform. It was mechanically reliable, easy to repair, adequately supplied with spare parts and ammunition. Its turret traverse was powered and fast, allowing it to track moving targets far better than the King Tiger's manual traverse system. It could reverse at decent speed, maneuver in tight spaces, cross bridges without fear of collapse. The Americans and British had done what they did best: identified a problem, inadequate gunpowder, and solved it with engineering pragmatism rather than wholesale redesign. They hadn't tried to build a better tank from scratch. They'd modified an existing, reliable platform with a better gun. The result was good enough to defeat the King Tiger without sacrificing the Sherman's fundamental strengths. For Piper and his crews, the appearance of the Firefly marked the end of whatever slim hope remained. The King Tigers couldn't outshoot them anymore, couldn't rely on armor superiority anymore, and couldn't use tactical mobility to compensate because they were stuck in mud or out of fuel. The German technical advantage, purchased at enormous cost in production time and complexity, had been neutralized by a modification that probably took a few thousand man-hours to implement per tank. On December 24th, Christmas Eve, the offensive finally ground to its terminal halt. Piper's column, reduced to a fraction of its original strength, surrounded by American forces and completely out of fuel, ammunition, and options, received orders to abandon all vehicles and attempt to reach German lines on foot. The crews rigged demolition charges, working methodically in the falling snow. Each tank took time to properly destroy. You had to make sure the gun was wrecked beyond repair, the engine disabled, the optics shattered. And they'd been trained to deny the enemy any useful intelligence or salvageable equipment. Piper walked the line of abandoned vehicles one last time before the detonations began. King Tigers, Panthers, Tiger-Is, half-tracks, trucks, an armored column that had stretched 16 miles, now reduced to a static display of German ambition and German failure. Some of the tanks showed battle damage, scorched paint and penetration holes where Allied fire had found weak points. But most were pristine, killed by their own weight, their own complexity, their own impossible fuel consumption. The charges went off in sequence, each explosion a dull crump, muffled by snow. Turrets sagged as internal structures melted. Gun barrels drooped as shaped charges cut through them. Engines became scrap metal under the force of explosives placed in cylinder blocks. Walking away through the forest, Piper heard more explosions in the distance. Other German units abandoning their vehicles, destroying what they couldn't take with them. The Ardennes offensive, Hitler's great gamble to split the Allied armies and buy time for negotiated peace, had lasted 8 days before collapsing under the weight of its own logistical impossibility. The King Tigers remained where they'd died, prehistoric beasts stranded in the wrong era. Over the following months, American and British salvage crews would come through, towing the hulks to collection points for study and eventual scrapping. The photographs would become iconic. Massive German tanks sitting abandoned in snow-covered forests, their crews gone, their purposes unfulfilled. It's those images told the story more eloquently than any after-action report. Germany had built the world's most powerful tanks and then discovered that power without sustainability was just expensive failure. The bigger is better philosophy had produced behemoths that couldn't cross bridges, couldn't navigate forest roads, couldn't be repaired in the field, couldn't be fueled adequately, and couldn't be produced in sufficient numbers to matter. The Americans had built 50,000 adequate tanks. Germany had built 500 perfect ones. On paper, perfection should win. In reality, adequacy backed by overwhelming logistics crushed perfection backed by nothing. Years later, military historians would walk these same forests, finding rust-eaten remnants of the King Tiger still half buried in the mud where they'd been abandoned. They'd photograph them, so measure them, write analytical papers about the tactical and strategic failures of the Ardennes offensive. But the real lesson was simpler and more brutal than any academic analysis could capture. In modern warfare, logistics defeats legend every single time. The King Tigers had been legends, 72 tons of German engineering pride, guns that could destroy anything they could see, armor that promised invincibility. And they died anyway. Not with dramatic last stands, but with quiet mechanical failures and empty fuel tanks, monuments to the fatal flaw of building weapons you couldn't sustain in combat. The Ardennes had become a graveyard for primeval beasts, and the snow fell softly on their metal corpses, covering them like shrouds.